The millionaire felt ashamed of his wife and took his mistress to a luxurious party. But when he arrived, what happened paralyzed his soul. I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. The luxurious hall of the Imperial Hotel gleamed under the golden lights of the crystal chandeliers. Soft music floated in the air while the guests, dressed in their finest attire, toasted with champagne flutes. James Garcia moved confidently among them, shaking hands, exchanging fake smiles, and receiving praise as if it were his birthright. By his side, Sophia, his mistress, radiated beauty in a tight black dress designed to draw all eyes. James carried her with pride, like a trophy, convinced that no one would question his choice. His wife, Michelle, had not been invited. To him, her presence was unnecessary, even embarrassing. She didn't belong in the world of perfection and appearances he had built. Sophia slid her fingers along James's arm and whispered with a charming smile, "Everyone is looking at us, just as you wanted." He nodded, satisfied. He controlled the room, as always. But just as James was about to make a toast, a murmur rippled through the hall. The guests turned toward the entrance, and the air seemed to thicken. Annoyed by the interruption, James followed their gazes, and his stomach clenched. There, standing in the doorway, was Michelle. She was no longer the discreet, submissive woman he had cast aside. She was no longer the shadow that accepted his neglect without complaint. Her crimson-red dress contrasted against her skin, her lips painted in the same bold shade, and her eyes held a confidence James couldn't recall ever seeing before. The silence in the room became deafening. Every step Michelle took echoed against the marble floor as she moved with a grace that outshone every woman present, including Sophia. The murmurs grew, and admiring gazes trailed after her. James swallowed hard. Since when did his wife have that presence? Since when could she captivate the elite of the city without even trying? Sophia shifted uncomfortably, leaning toward James. "Who is she?" He didn't answer. His eyes were locked onto Michelle, on the way she casually took a champagne flute from a passing waiter and toasted with a man James knew all too well, Jones Williams, one of the most important investors in his company. His blood boiled in his veins. Williams leaned toward Michelle with a charming smile, and instead of stepping away like she would have in the past, she returned his gesture with ease. Their conversation flowed naturally, oblivious to the world around them. James felt a tight knot in his stomach as he watched Williams place a hand on Michelle's waist, pulling her slightly closer. Humiliation struck him like a punch to the chest. Things had never slipped out of his control before. He had always been the most respected man in any room, the one whose presence commanded authority. But now, for the first time, he felt the ground crumbling beneath him. He tried to reclaim his dominance. He strode toward Michelle with firm steps, but before he could reach her, a hand clapped onto his shoulder. It was Carlos Velasco, another influential businessman. "I had no idea you were married to a woman like her," he remarked in a casual tone, though amusement gleamed in his eyes. "It seems everyone is quite taken with her. Funny how you never brought her around before." A chill ran down James's spine. As he struggled to respond, his gaze met Michelle's. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her mere presence, her confidence, the way she had walked in and effortlessly stolen the spotlight. It was all a demythification of war. James clenched his jaw, feeling his anger and frustration burn inside him. Michelle raised her glass toward him and, with a subtle smile, took a sip. A furious heat crept up James's neck. He turned to Sophia for support, but she looked uncomfortable, aware that the attention she had basked in moments ago was fading. A waiter passed by James, and in his irritation, he nearly knocked over the tray of glasses. His breath came faster. He couldn't allow this to continue. He took another step toward Michelle, this time with no interruptions. He saw her smile and brush Williams's arm in a gesture that seemed casual, but was anything but. James clenched his fists. "What are you doing here?" Michelle turned toward him slowly, her expression poised. "Here? Oh, James, this has always been my world. You just never wanted to see it." Her words hit harder than any public humiliation. A murmur spread through the room. His wife, the woman he had dismissed, was now looking at him with crushing confidence, daring him to keep denying what was happening. James felt the blood pounding in his temples. Never in his life had he felt so vulnerable. Michelle tilted her head slightly, and with the same elegance she had arrived with, she turned back to Williams. James felt his perfect world shattering before his eyes. Before we continue with the story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. James could only hear the echo of voices in the room, but he couldn't distinguish a single word. His vision had narrowed to one single point: Michelle. She continued conversing with Jones Williams, laughing with the ease of someone who knew she was admired. The contrast was cruel. For years, James had believed his wife was insignificant, a shadow meant to remain in the background. But now, she shone brighter than anyone at the party. He tried to regain his composure, gripping Sophia's hand, but her fingers were cold. She, too, had noticed the shift in the room, the unexpected turn of attention. The pressure on James mounted when another investor, Rodolfo Santamaria, approached with an inquisitive smile. "Garcia, old friend, how is it that you never introduced us to your wife? I must say, she has quite an imposing presence," he remarked with a tone that was both curious and mocking. A shiver ran down James's spine. He had never imagined this scenario. Michelle wasn't just at the party. People were starting to notice her absence in all the past events. "You always kept her so far from these gatherings that we thought she preferred the quiet of home," Santamaria continued with a smirk. James swallowed hard. Sophia, uncomfortable with the conversation, squeezed his arm gently. "James, let's go somewhere else," she murmured. But he couldn't move. His legs were anchored to the ground, his mind repeating the same question over and over. How was it possible that Michelle had this effect on people? Across the room, Michelle felt her husband's gaze burning into her, and instead of feeling uneasy, she turned slowly and met his eyes with a calmness that disarmed him. James, who had spent his entire life in absolute control, felt, for the first time, that he had lost his grip on power. She raised her glass with elegance and toasted in silence. James felt a burn in his chest. He couldn't allow this to continue. He stepped forward decisively, leaving Sophia behind. But by the time he was close enough, Michelle was no longer alone. Another man had approached her. Sebastian Acosta, one of the city's most influential businessmen, inclined his head slightly and offered his hand. "May I have this dance?" Michelle smiled and placed her hand in his with a natural grace that made James feel sick. The music shifted to a mesmerizing melody, and Sebastian led her onto the dance floor with effortless movements. James watched as his wife, the same woman he had ignored for years, now twirled gracefully in another man's arms. The murmurs in the room grew. The comments were barely whispers, but to James, they roared like a deafening storm. "They look good together. I always thought Michelle was overshadowed by her husband, but look at how she shines." Maybe James made a mistake by never giving her the place she deserved. James clenched his fists. This was unacceptable. He took another step forward, determined to put an end to his humiliation, but then a voice stopped him cold. "Let her go." The words were spoken in a low, firm tone. James turned sharply. "What did you just say?" Williams took a sip of his drink and looked at him calmly. "Don't be pathetic, Garcia. You know exactly what's happening here. We all do. Or do you actually think no one noticed what you did by bringing that woman with you?" He nodded towards Sophia with his chin. James felt his blood boil with rage. "This doesn't concern you." Williams smirked. "Oh, no? Then explain why this entire room is more interested in your wife than in you. Since when did you stop being the center of attention?" The mockery in his voice was the final blow. James felt his pride shatter into 1,000 pieces. Without thinking, he marched toward the dance floor, pushing past people in his way. Michelle, still dancing, noticed him approaching, and her smile widened slightly, not in fear, not in submission, but with a serenity that unsettled him even more. When he was close enough, he extended his hand brusquely. "Michelle, we need to talk." Sebastian didn't let go of her immediately. "I believe she's busy." James shot him a lethal glare. "She is my wife." Michelle tilted her head with a calculated gesture. "Oh, really?" I thought I was just the woman meant to stay at home while you paraded someone else around. The air in the room thickened. Everyone was watching the confrontation unfold. James gritted his teeth. But before he could respond, Michelle made the decision for him. She gracefully stepped away from Sebastian and stood before James. If you want to talk, do it now. For a moment, James felt a flicker of victory, but it disappeared when Michelle added, in a voice low yet loud enough for others to hear, "Just don't expect me to stay quiet like I used to." Her words detonated like a bomb in the room. James felt the weight of every gaze on him. Never had he imagined his wife possessing such boldness. She turned and walked toward one of the terrace doors. James followed, his jaw clenched and his heartbeat erratic. Michelle had just played her strongest card, and he wasn't sure how to respond. The air on the terrace was thick with tension. Michelle walked with measured steps, stopping at the marble railing while James followed closely, his body rigid, feeling the fury and frustration coursing through his veins. He couldn't stand what had just happened inside the ballroom. He couldn't tolerate how Michelle had exposed him, how she had humiliated him without even raising her voice. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze with a calm, almost amused expression. There was no trace of the submissive woman he had ignored for years. "What do you want, James?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. He clenched his fists. "What is this about, Michelle? Is this your way of humiliating me in front of everyone?" Michelle arched an eyebrow. "You feel humiliated? How ironic, considering you were the one who pushed me into the shadows while parading your mistress around as if I didn't exist." Her words hit him like a punch to the stomach. James took a deep breath, trying to regain control of the situation. "Don't make a scene over nothing." She let out a dry laugh. "A scene? I haven't done anything, James. I simply walked into a party where I had every right to be as your wife. If anyone made a spectacle, it was you, bringing Sophia along like a trophy." The contempt in her voice disarmed him for a moment. He had never heard Michelle speak like this. She had always been submissive, obedient, willing to play the role he had assigned her in their marriage. But now, she was someone entirely different. James ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "Why are you here? What do you want?" Michelle held his gaze without blinking. "I'm here because I'm done hiding. Because for years, I let you make me feel invisible. But you know what? Not anymore." A shiver ran down James's spine. For the first time in his life, he felt like he had no control over a situation. His jaw tightened as he tried a different approach. "If you think this will make me look bad, you're wrong. No one cares what you do, Michelle." She smiled, but there was a defiant glint in her eyes. "No one cares? That's funny, because from what I saw, everyone seemed quite impressed by my presence tonight. In fact, some were even wondering why you never introduced me before." James felt the anger rising in his chest. He hated to admit it, but Michelle was right. The investors, the businessmen, even his closest acquaintances, everyone had noticed her absence at previous events, and now that she was here, they couldn't help but question why he had kept her hidden. "Don't get ahead of yourself, Michelle. You're still the same woman I left at home. A nice dress and a rehearsed smile won't change that." Michelle tilted her head, unshaken. "Is that what you think? Then tell me, James, if I'm still the same. Why do you look so nervous?" He opened his mouth to respond, but just then, the terrace door swung open. Sophia appeared, arms crossed, her expression tense. "What's going on here?" Michelle glanced at her up and down, completely composed. "Nothing that concerns you." Sophia let out a mocking laugh. "Oh, it concerns me. James is my partner now." Michelle chuckled softly. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like he's been far too busy with me to pay you any attention." Sophia's face twisted with fury, while James tensed further. This was spiraling out of control. Sophia took a step toward Michelle. "Don't think that just because you showed up tonight, anything will change. James is with me, not you." Michelle looked at her with a mix of pity and amusement. "Oh, Sophia, how naive you are." Sophia clenched her teeth. "Excuse me?" Michelle stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Tell me something. Have you noticed that James hasn't stopped looking at me since I arrived? Or that, despite having you by his side all night, He couldn't resist following me out here. Sophia blinked, suddenly uncertain for the first time that evening. She glanced at James, searching for reassurance, but he said nothing. Michelle's smile widened with satisfaction. I thought you were smarter than this. Sophia felt the heat of humiliation rising to her throat. She turned to James and gripped his arm tightly. We're leaving. But James didn't move. Sophia frowned. James. He was still looking at Michelle, confused, furious, and, above all, completely unsettled. Sophia felt the crushing weight of disgrace. Her wounded pride blinded her for a moment. Without thinking, she raised her hand to slap Michelle. But before her palm could reach her face, James caught her wrist. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophia stared at him in disbelief. Are you stopping me for her? James released her wrist carefully, without a word. Sophia took a step back, feeling as though the ground had been pulled from under her. Michelle watched the scene unfold with a triumphant smile. Looks like the party is ending early for some people. Sophia felt like she was going to explode. She shot James one last look before turning on her heel and storming away. Michelle sighed and turned back to James. Well, that was easier than I thought. James stared at her with a mix of admiration and resentment. Who are you? He murmured, unable to recognize the woman standing before him. Michelle stepped closer, stopping just inches from his face. I'm the woman you never knew how to value, James. The air between them grew heavy. She smiled and patted his shoulder before walking away with the same elegance with which she had entered. James remained on the terrace, his pride in shambles and a single question burning in his mind. How had he lost control of everything in just one night? The party continued, but for James, everything had stopped the moment Michelle left him standing alone on the terrace. For years, he had been the center of attention, the powerful man who dictated the rules. But now, he felt like a stranger in his own world. He ran a hand over his face, trying to regain his composure before stepping back into the ballroom. But as soon as he crossed the threshold, the scene before him completely unsettled him. Michelle was at the center of a group of businessmen, laughing elegantly, holding her champagne glass with the ease of someone who had always belonged in that circle. And worst of all, his biggest investor, Taylor Johnson, was looking at her with unmistakable interest. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Johnson was a powerful man, with an empire that rivaled his own in some sectors. An important ally, but also a dangerous competitor. If Michelle had managed to capture his attention, he took a deep breath, controlling his irritation. He wasn't going to let Michelle continue stealing the spotlight. With firm steps, he walked toward the group, asserting his presence. I hope everyone is enjoying the evening, he said with a measured smile. Michelle didn't flinch. She only turned slightly, meeting his gaze with that same devastating calm as before. Very much so, she replied, not breaking eye contact. Taylor Johnson smirked knowingly. We were just discussing how remarkable your wife is, James. I must say, I feel deceived. How is it possible that you've never brought her to events like this? James forced a smile. Michelle prefers discretion. That's a shame, Johnson replied, taking a sip of his drink. A woman like her could have changed many things in the business world if she had been more present. Michelle tilted her head slightly, still smiling. Perhaps I'm finally ready to take my own place in this world. James felt a sharp sense of alert. There was something in the way she said it, in the confidence with which she looked at him, that made him realize this was more than just a single night of humiliation. Michelle had a plan. Determined to regain control, he extended his hand toward her. Dance with me. Michelle looked at him intently. For a moment, she seemed to hesitate. But then, with a slight nod, she accepted. He placed his hand on her waist and led her to the center of the dance floor. The music enveloped the ballroom in a sophisticated melody. From the outside, they looked like the perfect couple, but between them, the tension was as thick as a storm about to break. What are you after with all of this, Michelle? James murmured. She held his gaze without blinking. What I've always wanted, James. My place. Your place has always been by my side. Michelle let out a soft laugh. No, James. My place has always been in your shadow. Until today. James spun her gracefully, keeping up the elegance of the dance. But inside, he was seething. Don't think that just because you've caught some attention for one night, you can change the rules of the game. And who says I'm still playing by your rules? James clenched his jaw. You're overestimating your power here. Michelle leaned in slightly, her lips brushing near his ear. Do you really think so? Because so far, I haven't lifted a single finger, and yet, look at where we are. Imagine if I decided to go further. Her words cut deep, but before he could respond, someone interrupted. Mind if I steal this dance? James turned with a frown and found himself facing Johnson, extending a hand toward Michelle. For a moment, Michelle didn't answer. But then, with a poised smile, she released James's hand and took Johnson's. Of course. James stood frozen. He watched as Michelle walked away, laughing softly as she allowed herself to be led by Johnson. Never, in all the years they had been together, had he felt what he was feeling now. Jealousy. Not the kind of jealousy he had felt with other women, when someone tried to interfere with what he considered his territory. No, this was worse. It was the certainty that he was losing Michelle, not as a wife, but as the only person who had ever truly been at his level. He tried to keep his composure, but at that moment, Sophia reappeared beside him. Do you finally get it, James? He turned sharply. What are you talking about? Sophia smirked with disdain. That you lost. And the worst part? Michelle didn't even have to try. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't plot against you. You were the one who pushed her to this point. James gritted his teeth. Shut up, Sophia. But she only laughed. Maybe now you understand how I felt tonight. Ignored. Replaced. James felt his anger boil over. You were never important to me. Sophia looked at him with a mixture of scorn and pity. Oh, I know. But the interesting part is that now, neither is Michelle. Because, James, you don't have her anymore. With that, Sophia walked away, leaving him alone in the middle of the ballroom, with the crushing realization that, for the first time in his life, he was completely defeated. James had never tasted defeat so closely. His life had always been about absolute control, about being the man everyone feared, respected, or wanted to impress. But now, in a ballroom filled with eyes that no longer belonged to him, he felt everything he had built crumbling. Michelle was no longer the woman he had disregarded for years. She was no longer the quiet shadow hidden behind his name. Now, she was a force of her own, surrounded by influential people, admired by businessmen, and looked at with undeniable interest by other men. James poured himself a drink and downed it in one gulp. He felt a burning rage rise in his throat, but he couldn't afford to let anyone see his state. He walked with steady steps, feigning indifference, pretending he didn't care. But the truth was, it consumed him. The scene before him was an insult to his ego. Michelle laughed with Taylor Johnson, tilting her head slightly, as if she were completely comfortable in his company. There was no trace of the submission James had imposed for years. He clenched his fists. He had to do something. He couldn't let Michelle humiliate him this way. He couldn't let her ignore him as if he didn't exist. With determined steps, he moved toward her, interrupting the conversation without caring about the curious glances from those around them. I need to talk to you, he said firmly. Michelle arched a brow, as if his presence was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Then, she took a slow sip from her glass before responding. I'm busy, James. The disdain in her tone hit him like a slap. Johnson smirked. Are you sure it can't wait? We were in the middle of a rather interesting conversation. James felt an irrational urge to shatter the glass in his hand. He took a deep breath. Michelle. Now. She held his gaze for a moment longer before letting out a soft sigh. Then, with unshakable calm, she set her glass on the table and walked toward a more secluded corner of the ballroom. James followed, his own fury pulsing in his temples. Once they were far enough from prying ears, he turned to her, seething. What the hell do you think you're doing? Michelle looked at him with sheer indifference. What I should have done long ago, James. Taking my place. Your place? James let out a bitter laugh. Don't be ridiculous, Michelle. You're just a resentful woman trying to get attention. She gazed at him with amusement in her eyes. And am I succeeding? Her answer disarmed him for a second. Michelle tilted her head, studying him intently. Tell me, James, what bothers you more? That I'm here tonight, or that I no longer need you? James gritted his teeth. Don't play games with me. Why not? She smirked. You played with me for years. You hid me, discarded me, replaced me in front of everyone without a shred of respect. James felt a sharp pang in his chest. That's in the past. For you, maybe. For me, it's the reason I'm standing here now. A heavy silence fell between them, thick with unspoken words. James felt his grip on control slipping further with every second. You're not going to win this, he muttered. Michelle smiled with infuriating confidence. James, I already won. He was about to fire back, but before he could, a journalist approached, microphone in hand. Mr. Garcia, there's something everyone is wondering tonight, the man said with a curious yet mischievous smile. Your wife has been the revelation of the event. She's earned the admiration of everyone here. Why have we never seen her at these gatherings before? James felt his world collapse in a single second. He was speechless. His mind raced, desperate for an appropriate answer, but anything he said would make him look like a fool. If he admitted that he had kept Michelle hidden because he found her unremarkable, he'd come across as a shallow, pathetic man. If he said she preferred discretion, anyone who had seen her tonight would know it was a lie. Michelle, on the other hand, didn't waste the opportunity. Well, sometimes people make mistakes, she said with an enchanting smile, looking at James with false sweetness. But the important thing is that we can always learn from them. The journalist's interest piqued. So, do you think your husband has learned something tonight? Michelle's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. I certainly hope so. James felt a knot tighten in his throat. The journalist thanked her for the response and moved on, leaving James and Michelle in an unbearable silence. He stared at her, torn between fury and desperation. Is this revenge? Is that what you want? Michelle tilted her head. Revenge? No, James. This isn't about revenge. She stepped closer, their faces mere inches apart. This is about justice. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving James alone, feeling, for the first time in his life, what it was like to have no control at all. James walked through the party with slow steps, feeling the weight of countless eyes piercing through him. For the first time in his life, he was not the center of attention for his success, but for his humiliation. The image he had meticulously built over the years was crumbling before his very eyes, and the worst part was, he was powerless to stop it. The echo of laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses felt like needles against his skin. He knew they were all talking about him, about how his wife, the woman he had belittled for years, had outshined him in a way he never imagined. Desperate to regain control, he approached a group of investors, hoping to steer the conversation in his favor. But the unease in their expressions said it all. No one wanted to be associated with a man whose credibility was now in question. James swallowed hard. He needed to talk to Michelle. He needed to regain at least a fraction of his lost control. He found her on the terrace, gazing at the illuminated city with a glass of wine in hand. Her silhouette exuded calm, as if the weight of the past had finally lifted off her shoulders. We need to talk, James said firmly. Michelle didn't turn immediately. She savored the moment, reveling in her newfound power before finally looking at him with serene amusement. Talk? Now that's new, she responded with a faint smile. James took a deep breath. I won't pretend I don't know what you did tonight, but tell me something. Do you really think this changes anything? Michelle arched an eyebrow. It changes everything, James. I am no longer the woman you could hide at home while parading another in public. James stepped closer, lowering his voice. This is just a performance. What we had, what we built, it's still there. Michelle let out a brief, humorless laugh. What we built? James, the only thing you ever built was a lie. And tonight, it finally collapsed. James felt desperation clawing at his chest. He couldn't let Michelle have the last word. He couldn't allow her to walk away believing she had one. Then tell me, what comes next for you? He asked harshly. Do you think this will make you happy? Michelle held his gaze. No, James. What will make me happy is knowing I will never again have to ask permission to exist. She turned toward him, stepping close enough that their faces were mere inches apart. And the best part, she whispered, now it's you who will have to live with the shame of losing me. A shiver ran down James's spine. Michelle placed her wine glass on the marble railing, turned, and walked away without a single glance back. James watched her go, his heart pounding and his hands clenched into fists. A part of him wanted to run after her, to tell her this wasn't how it was supposed to end, that none of this made sense. But his feet remained rooted in place. He was trapped in the very reality he had created. Sophia, who had once been his greatest source of pride, appeared beside him, clutching his arm with nervous urgency. James, we need to leave. For the first time that night, he truly looked at her. He took in her flawless dress, her meticulously applied makeup, the way she forced a smile, not out of joy, but to maintain appearances. And suddenly, it all felt empty. Sophia was not Michelle. She never would be. James pulled his arm away, stepping back. We're not going anywhere. Sophia's eyes widened in shock. What are you saying? You can't stay here after everything that happened. And what does it matter? James murmured, his voice losing its edge. His gaze swept the crowd, searching for Michelle, but she was gone. She had left. A knot tightened in his stomach. Not only had he lost her, but he knew he would never have another chance to get her back. The murmurs around him grew louder. Sophia, sensing that James was unraveling, discreetly stepped away, unwilling to be dragged down with him. James stood alone in the middle of the ballroom. The flashes of cameras momentarily blinded him. His perfect image was shattered. He was no longer James Garcia, the powerful, respected, and feared businessman. He was just a man who had lost everything. Thank you for listening to this incredible story until the end. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We also suggest watching the video that appears on the screen so you can discover other amazing stories, because I guarantee you'll be surprised.